Thank you, Peter. I actually prefer to think that Historic England paid me to go away. But anyway, to make it, I'll just start by making it clear. The excavations in Norton were done by JB Archaeology Limited. Many of you will know John Boodless. He's active in many roles in Yorkshire archaeology and beyond. And his company was commissioned to undertake work in advance of the replacement of the Brooklyn Youth Centre in Norton by another campus for the Norton Primary School. He brought me in as an advisor initially on things Roman, which worked fine. Then somehow I ended up project managing the post-excavation project and jointly being the main author for the volume. I'm not sure how he worked that one, but it seemed to be okay in the end. So, with no more ado, it's an interesting project. It's a slightly strange project in some ways, and that's because rubbish is so important, but we'll come to rubbish later. Now, I'm sure most of you will know where Norton is. It's on the opposite bank of the River Derwent to Malton, across the river from the fort, and we were working. Is the mouse visible on the screen? Yeah. Yes. Can you see? Yes. Thank you. Okay. We were working on the line adjacent to the line of Lambton Road, which is this major road, the major road here, which actually is just to the east of the line of the main Roman road from Malton Norton to York and also to the Humber River crossing. So it's quite prominent location, and the importance of that will become apparent very quickly, I think. But we were faced with what was, in effect, a greenfield site in the middle of housing in Norton, which unfortunately recently was described by some consultants, which I'm not one, as a village. It's not. Norton is a town, and there's a great deal of pride in Nortoners, if that's actually a word, given seeing themselves to be different and equal to the people who live in Malton. That's a modern rivalry. I think from a Roman period, we can actually ignore that. But what the key element here is that Norton did expand from a village in the Victorian period, focused in the area of a river crossing here, massively, down the major roads in the Victorian and Edwardian period, and with housing estates constructed further out and down here in the 30s and 50s. So what we've seen is a relatively rapid expansion of what had been a relatively small settlement. We are fortunate and also unfortunate with regard to the archaeology which was destroyed by those developments. But as you'll see here, early ordnance survey map, record of Roman coins found here in the area which is now occupied by the primary school. But also, okay, I'm going to destroy the university. Right, fine. But what happened both in the Victorian period and through the 30s and 50s is there was a lot of recording of archaeology, ad hoc recording in the Victorian period, most of which is reported in the pages of a now defunct newspaper, the Malton Messenger, but also drawn together by a name which by a lady whose work I'm sure you'll be familiar with, Mary Kitson Clark. It actually has a larger entry in her gazetteer than Malton does, and so that's one up to Norton. But then the other work was done by the likes of Sir Edward Hildyard in the 30s and later, and also Sir Edward Whitley, who excavated pottery kilns, which I'll show you the location of later. And a key person in this recording was Raymond Hayes, who many of you will know from his work across the eastern part of Yorkshire, and particularly on the North York moors. So there is an antiquarian tradition of discoveries, which is great. We have records of discoveries, but sometimes they ain't too precise. You sort of many references to the discovery of urns were they just pots, or were they cremation urns? Sometimes we actually get a reference to cremated bone being found, but we have a demonstration of the intensity of occupation in the Roman period on the north side of the river from those antiquarian and later finds. Now, just to go back. No, I have to go back too far. So initially, surprise, surprise, geophysics. The existing building, which was the Brooklyn House Youth Centre, is there. Some work had been done on the site in 2002 by what is now MAP Archaeological Practice, who recorded service trenches on the access road to the site, which is off the plan here, but you'll see later. And a couple of infant or in utero burials was recorded. The line of the Roman version of Langton Road is somewhere about out here, just beyond the limits of the site. This is this green line here represents the back of property boundaries on the western side of Langton Road. I'm glad my knees don't let me dig through winters anymore. These are two of John's stalwart diggers cleaning off trial trenches in the playing field to the south of the school buildings. And you can see that the archaeology is literally at the bottom of the plough depth. There are limited records about what's happened on the site pre-development, but obviously at some stage it's been ploughed, almost certainly during the Second World War, but also possibly earlier, and it may have been within the Victorian fields associated with the farms in and around Norton. The archaeology in those trenches was not particularly exciting, but it was there, it needed recording, it was adding to a picture of Roman Morton and Norton. And we have post holes, we have ditches, obviously a complex of ditches intercutting. Seems to be in the Roman period field system, not surprising, coming out from a town adjacent to the Roman road. Another picture of a ditch, just to emphasise the fact that it is more than one phase of activity. Now, we get to the serious stuff. I'm not suggesting that the digging in the winter wasn't serious. I suspect they regarded it as very serious. But this is where we actually this is the main trench south of the buildings that we opened up for the development. This is now within the footprint of the existing school. I'll draw your attention to this location here, which hopefully, there's a plan, we have a building shown on the plan here, which, as you can see from the plan, survived not wonderfully well. Ploughing, this is it. But what this does is demonstrate the extension of occupation, probably housing, possibly housing and other associated activities, shops, storage, what have you, down the line of the Roman road. These buildings are 2nd to 3rd century, but we have very little in the way of we don't even have surviving floor levels. We actually have subfloor material in this area here. But what we do have is enough evidence to give us the basic plans of the structures. And one of the constraints of developer-funded archaeology is you're often told you can only go so deep, which can be a bit annoying, particularly when at the bottom of the foundation trench, which this wall was built over, you actually get this, which is an earlier phase of structures. So we actually have, from this tiny intervention here, a deep intervention here, we have evidence of early 2nd century and possibly earlier occupation down the line of the road, this far out from the river crossing, to an extent unexpected. This hopefully was photographed by John's colleagues, as suggesting it could be something of Interest? Well, it is of interest, but I can't tell you what it is. But it looks like it's a base of some form of tank or cistern or similar. But as an isolated find, it was challenging to interpret. We've also got burials. This is a young child in a small pit with evidence for scurvy, rickets, and possibly thalassemia, which I probably mispronounced, but that seems to be particularly unpleasant, as it actually can include effectively osteoarthritis, which in a child is pretty scary. But there has a whole range of symptoms, and I did actually print them out, and I've left them on my desk, so I apologise for that. But to the east of that large area, a smaller trench was opened up, which revealed this flue from a T-shaped oven or corn dryer or malting oven. The business end would have started here, but again we were constrained by the limits. We weren't allowed to take the turf off here. This is the joys of commercial archaeology. But now we move north, and that is all of the grey areas are standing buildings. This wall here represents a site boundary, which you'll see very shortly. And this is the access road, which is where MAP recorded a trench in 2002 and got a couple of young infant burials probably. But I'll draw your attention to this black spot. We'll come back to it. It's a very interesting black spot, I promise you. So this is, again, the reality of commercial archaeology. We were able to excavate a strip through the rear part of a whole series of Roman period buildings dating to the 3rd and 4th centuries. These walls extend out beyond the garden wall here, and it's seen in this case, and the buildings seem to be coming to an end here, but we weren't able to strip this area, which remained as hard-standing in the new development. Again, as with the not so well preserved building I showed you earlier, we're looking at strip buildings, the sort of buildings you expect to see in any town. In Norton, there's the well-known townhouse and other buildings excavated south of the fort in Orchard Field, which can demonstrate that these can actually be high-status structures. The so-called townhouse contained the only mosaic known in Malton Norton, as well as wonderful painted wall plaster, which has been reconstructed by the excavator, Reverend Smith, as a goddess with a nimbus around her head, and I think, seems a perfectly reasonable reconstruction. Seems even better, it had a beer named after a Malt Goddess beer produced by Malt Brewery. Excuse me. But again, you can see the level of preservation. We've lost the floor levels. We are actually dealing with more than one phase of building. We have one wall here, which is replaced by this one, and cut by the one which is, oh God, so I'm about to point at the screen with my finger, which will just see the edge of the wall running across at right angles here. So we have, again, several phases of occupation demonstrating an intensity of use of this area. Further image of those walls more clearly exposed. And again, this we initially thought was another phase of walling, but we think is actually laid as a subfloor material to actually provide a firm base for floors which we no longer have above it. Now, we move into the access road. And again, you'll see why I'm quite keen. I'm quite delighted that I don't actually do much field archaeology these days, because those are the digging conditions. I'm sure the banksman who was guiding that truck was very competent, but I think I'd prefer to be out of the trench. Anyway, obviously, these trenches were being put in literally to bring services in, so we had limited access. There were other trenches of a similar nature on the other side of the road, and there we actually got, if you like, the star find of the site. Very unprepossessing area of white, apparently filling a pit, which actually proved to be a very interesting pit. Here we have a Norton ware pot, late 2nd to 3rd century in date, and there we have it being excavated. We actually managed to persuade the developers to allow us to expand the trench, and you can see the pot is surrounded by burnt material, and it's also filled with burnt material. It is a cremation burial, what's known as a Buston burial, where the cremation took place above a pot which was already in a hole, with the burnt material being normally fairly randomly brushed into the pot. So you're not just getting bone, you're getting soil, you're getting remnants of the burnt materials, but which cremation took place on branches or whatever. But we'll come back to what came out of this later. But Buston burials are not that common. They are fairly well known in the north of England as opposed to the south, but we do get a few in the south. They're often associated with the military, and that is the association we see in areas other than Britain as well, that tend to be military associated. Now, that's a pot removed with contents intact and excavated in the York Archaeological Trust, or York Archaeology as it now is, conservation lab. And this is one of the first finds to have come out of it, part of a military belt plate. That's an X-ray of it, and there is an element of, believe me, I'm an archaeologist here, but if you look closely, you can actually see objects or parts of objects visible in the X-ray. And we are fairly convinced that we have the core of the cremation going into the pot, in this case, along with material which was cremated along with its owner. This is a reconstruction by my colleague, Dr. Hilary Cool, who has examined the finds and suggested that they are evidence of a military belt and a baldric, which is the strap which would go over the shoulder and a sword would be suspended from. And we also have these objects here, which appear to be the ends, the bronze copper alloy ends of scroll holders. Although obviously the scrollers no longer survive if they were buried, if they went into cremation at all. But the plates are paralleled in the Netherlands and in Morocco, and are the type which Hilary is convinced is mid-second to mid-3rd century, and is unequivocally military, or at least civilian high official. But that tends to be later, so these are probably certainly somebody who was military, at least in their professional life. The reason I say that is because this burial is made in an area which I'll show you later has produced other burials, but what we've not found at Norton is a military cemetery of the type that has been excavated at places like Bird Oswald, where it's actually lies to the west of the fort and is eroding off the cliff into the River Irving. But there they do have, there is a cremation cemetery. I'm not sure that they have any certain buster, but there is one probable one. And military cemeteries tend to be located in a place where they can be seen from the fort. And it's well known that Roman period burials are in part because of the law of the 12 tables, which demands that burial of any adult takes place outside the settlement, but also they're located adjacent to a road, so people can pay their respects to their deceased relatives, or indeed the dead generally, not necessarily people who they have any relationship to. However, this one is in an area of what appears to be a civilian cemetery. We have no other evidence of military burials in that area, although we do have some from not the immediate, not very close, but within what I'm going to suggest is the area of that cemetery later. And it's likely that this is a retired soldier, somebody who actually may have served in the garrison at Malton, but as was common, even before soldiers were legally allowed to marry in the 3rd century, had a family locally and lived, when he retired, he lived in the civilian settlement surrounding the fort. And it seems that this bust and burial may well have been his family's attempt to honour his military background. They've got his military belt, they've got his baldric, they even include a knife in the burial. Not a military knife, but perhaps as a token weapon. And but equally, many military busts have really nice square cut military pits. You can actually see that being ordered to make it square. This is a round hole which has been used, but it seems to be an attempt to produce something that's recognisable as in keeping with the buster tradition and perhaps in keeping with the wishes of the deceased as expressed when alive. Now, this is not quite a random list of finds, but it shows a range of material which came from the site. And this is where the rubbish bit comes in, because the buildings go out of use in the 4th century, in some of them early-ish in the 4th century, and the areas around them appear to have been used as a town dump. They've got vast amounts of material, including pottery, metal finds, of civilian and, quote, military character are found just in this massive soil which builds up around the defunct structures. And there are obviously military items, the armour, arrowheads, ballista bolts. Obviously, arrowheads could be for hunting, but what we do have is a range of things, including some things which are quite unusual and of intrinsic interest. To start with, just as a random sample of, yes, there's broken potting amongst it. Mostly the Norton fabrics, which were in production in the 2nd and 3rd century, but also we see a lot of Cranbeck material coming in later when Norton has ceased to be the dominant pottery supply, and Cranbeck, which is dominating the pottery supply of most of northern England, is actually making its way into Norton as well, which, okay, it's only 7-8 miles away, so it's not surprising. But Norton potteries may, in part, to an extent, go on into the 4th century. There is a debate about the end date of Norton pottery. Quite fun pots. I like the little thumb pot, toy pot, votive pot, call it what you will. It was found amongst rubbish. We don't know. The face pots are something which is a strong element of the Norton repertoire, and they include the so-called smith pots with the hammer, and also some of them have tongs, although we haven't got a photograph of any tongs here. Also, this appears to be potentially intended to be hair with an ear here, so we have face pots. Now, the question is, what are these? Are they ritual? Do they have religious significance? There certainly seems to be a strong element of potential worship of the of Vulcan, the Smith god, I'll talk about industry in Malton and Norton later, but that is one possible explanation. But also, the face pots are suggested often to, when you get the really nice ones, not like these, they actually appear to be suggested as potentially portrait pots of members of the imperial family, particularly empresses. But I'm not saying any empress had dot motif hair. But anyway, but also, we've got a lot of late Cranbeck ware, Cranbeck parchment wares, red painted decoration. And that means we're getting material going into that area, being dumped in that area. In the last quarter or last 30 years of the 4th century and probably beyond. We don't know when they ceased to use Cranbeck. Production, the end date, the pottery specialists fight about it, and I'll let them carry on fighting each other. But we're looking at production which may go beyond 400, or certainly the use of the pots which are produced before 400 will inevitably carry on beyond that date. This is nice. It's the crest of a cockerel painted red in Cranbeck parchment ware. Again, late 4th century, definitely. And possibly, almost certainly, I would say, relate potentially a religious votive. But that is the bit we've got. Other highlights of the pottery include a new East Goarly stamp for Samian. Well, that's great. I'm sure somebody's totally excited about it. Stamp for Stamp Mortaria. These give us a lot of information about the original origins of the material that was transported in the amphora. But the problem is the amphora get reused, and so you can't actually make a direct connection from, I don't know, Spanish oil amphora to actually a Spanish oil having been its last use. That is maybe highly unlikely. And this evidence for continuation of pottery into the 5th century, ... Given the fact we were digging rubbish deposits, we cannot be certain, but it is highly likely. A very small selection of finds. This is one of John Boulis' own slides, and his usual understatement. But as you can see, arrowheads, that I think we'll see that, which is a jet object shortly. Counters in Samian and other ceramics. Brooches, rings, and inevitably coins. That's a simple tabulation of the material. And the reason for showing it is that phase 5 is when we're getting all the dumping of material. And that, just to emphasise, although there's a lot of data in the finds, it is actually data about what was going on off-site. The material, in large part, is being brought to the site and dumped. So we're looking at the products of activity in a wider area of Roman Norton, but also potentially, and given the militaria, hopefully, certainly, the Malton side of the river as well. But then we run into questions about the so-called military community. There used to be a view where you actually had the fort, dividing wall, civilians. You've got soldiers on the inside, civilians on the outside. When we actually look at what is being seen at sites like particularly Vindolanda, but also Newcastle and other sites, we're seeing much greater evidence of activity of the two being interdependent. We have evidence of large quantities of loss of large quantities of coins inside the fort's gates, literally inside the fort gates at Vindolanda and at Newcastle. And it seems possible that we're actually seeing trading activities happening within the fort rather than outside the fort. And it's been known, it's no great revelation to suggest that the functioning of these settlements, while not wholly dependent on the military, having 500 men with, or depending on the size of the fort, with sharp pointy things living there, actually meant there was a real focus for trade, a demand for services. And many of the activities which, in a legionary fortress might have been taken place in a formal fabrica, could actually have been taking place outside the fort. You've got the settlement servicing the fort by providing blacksmithing, by providing repairs facilities for the equipment and weapons of the troops. So what we're probably seeing is a much more integrated community. Yes, there are people who have sharp pointy things and go out and kill people occasionally, but also you've got a lot of people who are actually associated with them, dependent on them, but also they're also looking elsewhere as well. Malton Norton will have been a market centre for the surrounding area, and we can see around Malton Norton there are a number of villas, and the market for their product is going to have been Malton Norton and quite potentially York and Stamford Bridge as well. But we see also where towards Bridlington, where there's putative lost Roman port, a group of villas around Bridlington. So we're seeing what may have been a focus for economic activity, and we can see an integration between military and civilian, which is not the clear division which many people in the past would have presented it as. And we actually are seeing something which is responding to the local conditions and local demand. Yes, we got some prehistoric finds. We didn't get any prehistoric features. We also got post-medieval gunflint, and the fact that somebody was shooting over the field was not entirely surprising at some point. Coins, counterfeit denarii of Trajan, denarii of Trajan, Megabulus, and Orivana. Yes, we are actually seeing counterfeiting, but what does that mean? Does that mean there isn't adequate supply of coins and people are reduced to actually copying them to ensure they can actually carry out the trade they need to? Or are we actually seeing something which is more criminal, in that these are, as is the case, looks to be the case in the one to be this one, a silver wash over a base metal coin, and basically somebody's actually trying to rip somebody off. Those words don't appear in the report. Now, other things. Really nice bone needle case. It's a sheet metapodal, and the needles still survived in the case, concreted. And this jet pendant, apparently it is an unusual form, but jet Malton Norton is well known for. One of Malton Museum's star exhibits is a tiny little jet bear, which is lovely, and whoever found it had really good eyesight. Other finds, tweezers, bone hairpins, and okay, it's a strip of copper alloy. I'll leave it at that for this one. And some which are, if not unique, unusual. This is a pair of tongs, and Hilary Cool, in examining these, was convinced that they were not, although they were for a high temperature industry, they are not suitable for blacksmithing because of the way they pivot. You actually have your finger would go through to allow you to manipulate the tongs, and you ain't going to be sticking those into a furnace with your finger that close to it, because overall they're 35-40 centimetres long. So we're seeing evidence of craft and industry amongst the rubbish. And okay, this is what we called on site a weird duck burial. But the problem is it wasn't a duck, it was two geese. And they seem to be some form of foundation deposit. Buried adjacent to the wall, you have the two heads here, which would have had the wings when buried over them. There's some resemblance to a deposit outside the so-called kitchen at Lullingston Villa in Kent, although it was a bigger hole that they were in there. But this seems to be deliberate ritual activity on the site, in some way sanctifying or seeking a blessing for the building. And this is John's rather than mine, and I accept what he said. Geese had a status in the Roman period. They saved Rome at one point. The dogs didn't bark, but the geese sort of warned them about the Gauls who were attacking. So that may actually be how they were seen to be. Their burial might be propitious in terms of the future use and inhabitants of this building. Now, the extent of the civil settlement. This is out of date. It's from a paper I produced in 2016, but it was an easy slide to grab. This is the core of Malton, with a fort here. Evidence is known for outside the Northwest Gate, within Orchard Field itself, which is been the site of excavations by Reverend Smith in the 1950s and Peter Wenham in the 1960s, 70s, and is the location of the mosaic, which is still in situ on site, in the so-called townhouse, which is just outside the southeast gate. There's also evidence from slightly further to the west around the location of the present St Leonard's Church. Sorry, excuse me again. But in the mid-90s, planning permission was given for a new rugby club house and pitches between the fort and Old Malton, where in Old Malton there were finds recorded by both Mary Kitson Clark and later a chap called John Robinson, who produced a gazetteer of finds of all periods in the Norton area, published by the then Yorkshire Archaeological Society. Unfortunately, on the day they started stripping that site, there was an awful grating sound where the box scrapers went over 3 2nd to 3rd century Roman buildings, which were located on the southeastern side of the road line from the fort. Just English heritage, as it was then, when I was working for the time, put in money to allow Matt to record them. So we actually are seeing evidence of occupation here. Aerial photography has shown that there is activity in this area. Matt Oakey has published a paper in Yorkshire Archaeological Journal, I think for about 2012. And then more recently, University of York have excavated just on the eastern side of the old railway track, this black line here, and got substantial buildings either side of the road running towards Old Malton, and appear to have definite evidence of occupation into the 5th century. The sequence is such, and the stratigraphy is demanding that some of these structures must go beyond 400. That's great. Malt side of the river, Malt's the important bit, that's a posh bit. Entirely true. On the south side of the river, I've already referred to the recording that was done by the likes of Edward Hilliard, Ben Hayes, Edward Whitley, and others. And we actually know that there's civilian occupation in this area here, and there's suggestions of civilian buildings in this area. There's a road here called St Peter Street, and that's where that very grainy photograph, which I showed you early on, is from. But also there's occupation going out down the line of what is now Beverley Road and the areas between. But keep wanting to press the mouse to go forward, sorry. But to understand Norton, we actually need to break down the evidence. When we started the Brooklyn House work, we actually thought we knew, we had a good idea of what was happening with the cemeteries. We actually have the area of burials here, a large area of burials which took in Brooklyn House here, and then another area of burials here. Sorry, that grey line, sorry. And with evidence of industrial activity in this area here, various kilns showed by green dots, which may or may not show on the screen, I don't know, I hope they do. And then we had some spectacular finds. There's actually in the 19th century discovered when the original St Nicholas Church, which was located just about here, on the site of Norton swimming pool, if you know Norton that well, there's an inscription found which was to the genius of this place wishing a young slave good luck in the goldsmith's shop. Goldsmith's shop, it's the only one we have attested in Britain. Okay, we know there must have been others, but we actually have one in the industrial suburb, in inverted commas, of Roman Malton. We also have massive kiln concentration of kilns, particularly in this area here, and scattered across most of this here, and probably there, and odd ones elsewhere, which demonstrate the intensity and extent of the 2nd and 3rd century pottery industry, which existed in Norton. There are references in various reports to pottery from Malton, dating to the late first maybe, and 2nd centuries, and that seems to be, in many cases, probably either poor scholarship or laziness for actually it's pottery from Norton. I'm not saying there are no kilns in Malton, but we don't have any yet. And okay, somebody's going to start a development tomorrow, I'm going to be wrong, but that is archaeology. Our understanding at present is there's an intensity of use of the Norton area, which is servicing not only Malton, but a much wider area. And so we have the goldsmith's inscription from there. We have evidence of ironworking on Langton Road, north of Brooklyn House, which is down here. And then we have pottery kilns, particularly the model farm ones and the ones north of Commercial Street. There's actually an intensity of use that actually means we actually are looking at a settlement which extends to an area of use rather than settlement. It may extend to as much as 25 to 30 hectares over Malton and Norton, and possibly even more. I'm not saying it was all in use contemporaneously, but bizarrely, we actually find in Norton that we have areas where we have industrial activity, we then have burials, or we have areas of burials which then have occupation. That things change through time. The time depth is important. And although we actually have a very respectful attitude towards the dead, and I'm not suggesting that didn't exist in the Roman period, we do actually see areas which must have been known to actually have burials in them, being used for other things later on, apparently with impunity. But I don't know. Anyway, when we finished, when we produced a report on Brooklyn House, here we have Brooklyn House, and it's bust and burial. We seem to home in on there being smaller areas of more intensive burial. One here, well, Wood Street, Langton Road Junction. What I've tended to call Langton Road North, and then Langton Road South, this area here, but with buildings in between. So we haven't yet got any evidence of burials actually spreading through this area. So there may have been some zoning that held, but others, as I say, seems to have actually been overridden at times. And we actually know there's a substantial number of burials found here at 98 Langton Road, recorded by Raymond Hayes, with some adjacent ones in a house called L'Aquila next door. And there's an unfortunately unpublished cemetery from the Ridings, also in this area, where there's another 30 plus burials. But we have a scatter of burials across much of the northeastern part as well. So what we're seeing is a settlement which is industrial. It's cemeteries, it's occupation, but it changes through time. And I think that's a picture which we can probably see for the whole of Malton Norton. And yes, they didn't move the fort. That would have been it was too good a position on the bluff above the river, and why bother? Because they can, if anybody objects, they have 500 sharp pointy things to argue with. But beyond that, I think we have to see the settlement changing through time repeatedly. And well, thanks to North Yorkshire County Council for funding the project, as it was a school turning into a school. My colleague Janet Phillips directed the on-site work, and Sophie Tibbles, who may well be known to many of you, managed to find some post-ex. And John had a good working relationship with the Conisborough Research and Archaeology group, who volunteers helped on site at times, and obviously the contractors. If they had letters on the site, we wouldn't have had an excavation. Anyway, but the site's published. It was published in 2001 by Janet and myself as lead authors, and is available from Archaeopress Archaeology. And thank you for your attention.